Welcome back to our United Conservative Youth Podcast. I'm Seth Brown, Vice President of Youth for the Sherwood Park Constituency Association.
And I'm Evan Logue, VP of Membership for Strathcona-Sherwood Park Constituent Association.
This week, Premier Smith takes action after the courts block an Alberta separation petition.
Last sitting, the UCP passed Bill 25 to remove ideological bias in public schools.
And the UCP government has introduced legislation to provide oversight for Alberta's immigration system in light of federal overreach.
So let's jump straight into the Separatist petition being blocked. Justice Shanna Leonard ruled that the 300,000 signature Separatist petition violated the constitutional obligation to consult First Nations groups. She is the second judge to rule against the movement. Seth, how do you feel about this ruling?
Oh, I feel like we've been building what they call Western alienation in the province for a long time. And now it's been, especially under the Trudeau years, it's been building up. We've been building steam in our little pot, and it's not going to go away. And now the solution of people who are in the Liberal Party, who are liberal-oriented, is to put a lid on the pot as it's boiling and the steam is rising. But that's not going to actually fix anything. It just makes the steam build more. And what I find is the people who are inclined to support separation, they don't really trust Canadian institutions. And that's part of the reason why they want to leave Canada. Because they want to break away from the institutions that they don't believe serve them and they don't believe they can have any trust in. So then why is it the solution of liberals and liberal-oriented people, including the two judges who have decided this case, who were appointed by Justin Trudeau, why is it their approach to use those same institutions that these people do not have trust in to block their aspirations? It's only going to lead to further separatist sentiment. It's not going to solve the separation issue. It's just yet another example of nearsighted liberal political decisions, and I'm quite disappointed with how the judges have conducted themselves.
It is 100% making the situation worse. It's not beneficial to anyone to further put down this movement, because most people would agree that, from the polling, from all the information we've been gathering over the last year, it's only 30% of Canadians. But the more you try to put down a movement, the stronger it's going to get, and the stronger they're going to start feeling about it. And so I was really hoping that we would just let them do their vote, let it get it over with. They got the result, they got their vote. And if it failed, they can't complain because they did what they wanted. So I feel like it's only making the situation worse. But I do want to ask you if you think the judge's ruling reason for it being not consulting First Nations, do you think that ruling has any basis?
Well, no, because we are not America. We use the British system and British precedent and British traditions in our government. And part of that British tradition is that referendums are purely advisory. They have no binding effect on government, but they are designed to shape government policy and show the government the direction that the province is headed in. So the decision requiring that Indigenous people be consulted for the referendum itself is taken from a position, and these are judges, they should know very well that referendums have no legal binding. It is taken from the position that apparently the referendum is legally binding. Now, I believe that, there is a constitutional obligation to Indigenous consultation, whether people like it or not, but that is to be exercised. That is the responsibility of the people who are actually taking the actions, which is not the petitioners, it's the government. When the government decides how to deal with the petition, should it succeed. And this is all just a very poor excuse to get the referendum killed before it can reach the ballot box, because it's ideological games. And they have polluted our justice system for so long. Then that's why the UCP government has been trying to get the appointment of provincial judges passed down from the federal government. The federal government, for whatever reason, even though the courts are our jurisdiction, they appoint our judges. And they send these activist judges into our country. They undermine trust in our justice system with their rulings that are quite bogus. And they've done it all across Canada. In Ontario, they had that ruling on the bike lanes, which ruled that removing bike lanes was a violation of the right to life. These people think they can do whatever they want with the law, even if it doesn't make sense. And there is unfortunately no accountability mechanism for them. That is, accessible to the government. So I really do hope that we get provincial control over the appointment of our judges, so we can get the activist judges off the bench, and we can put in judges who, I truly don't care what party they support behind closed doors, as long as they will interpret the law, not redefine it.
Yeah. And my interpretation of this ruling is the judge is correct in saying that the First Nations groups are entitled to consultation. That is enshrined. They deserve to have that consultation. But Jeffrey Raff is also correct in saying that we have not reached the point of separatism where that consultation is required. And that is also backed up by a constitutional scholar from Saskatchewan, Dwight Newman, who also interpreted it as you can't just, it's not legally binding yet, and so you can't just throw it out because you think it might lead to something, because that's not what the law says. We have it's to the responsibility of the UCP government, who is a Canadian government, and so it is up for the UCP to have those talks with First Nations groups, but they will only have those talks if separatism passes through the referendum. There's no reason to have the talks if there's no public support for the separatism movement. And so, yeah, on the topic of judges, however, I did notice that both judges that have put rulings in the way of the referendum have been Justin Trudeau appointees, which doesn't automatically make them corrupt or in any way, but it is showing a pattern which does undermine the trust that people will have in that system. And honestly, I think, judges should either be elected or be provincially appointed. Bring the power down to either the province or the people, not to a government, which is mostly in Ottawa. It's not very fair to have a bunch of Liberal appointed judges in Alberta that is mostly a conservative province. So it's not fair. But unfortunately, it's the situation we have, and I'm glad that Danielle and Jeffrey Raff are going to try to appeal this decision. We'll see how that appeal works. But personally, I would prefer it because Danielle is under a lot of pressure right now by the Separatists to not to skip the referendum and just call a vote for separatism. And I would hope that she decides to stick to the appeal instead of going straight for a vote, because then that kind of undermines the whole going for a petition to prove that, people are actually wanting this. If you're just calling a vote, it looks more like it's her opinion, which I understand isn't, but she has to be cautious of how her public appearance is. So I'm really hoping for the appeal to go through. How about you?
Yeah. Well, I'm a federalist. I am a very strong federalist, but it's hard not to, as a proud Canadian, sympathize with the separatists who have gotten their petition rejected by completely asinine means. Really, when the will of the people, there are some 300,000 people who have signed that petition and expressed their will that they want Alberta to at the very least have a referendum on sovereignty. And their will gets rejected, not by the democratically elected parliament, which has the legislative assembly is entirely within their right to reject separation, even if the petition passes, because again, it's purely consultative. But it is just absolutely unacceptable, horrendous even, that the petition and the will of concerned Albertans could be blocked by someone who was not elected, someone who has no democratic legitimacy, someone who was not even appointed from Alberta, appointed by Ottawa, as you said. And, it's not just the Ottawa versus Alberta thing. It's not just it's undemocratic or that there's no legal basis. There is a clear double standard being put in place between the Alberta separation petition put forward by the Separatists and the Forever Canadian petition put forward by Mr. Lukaszuk and his organization. The Forever Canadian petition, no matter how Mr. Lukaszuk wants to dance around the point as he's been doing on the media and whatnot, it is a separation referendum. It calls for a referendum to be held on separation. As much as Mr. Lukaszuk doesn't want to admit that, that's what it says on the paper. That's the question that was asked to the some, I believe, 500,000 people who supported it. Where is the court backlash? Where is the backlash from all of these groups, from the NDP, from the Indigenous groups, to that petition, which is also calling for a separation referendum? It is a very clear double standard, and in the mind of a separatist, this just further shows that Canada doesn't work. As much as the people who support this kind of judicial warfare think that this is a noble, principled defense of Canada, it is only making the separatists, it is only galvanizing the separatists. It's going to make people who didn't really feel inclined towards separation support separation, because it shows that Canada is broken. And contrast that to Premier Smith's approach. She has been trying to say, let me show you that Canada can work. Let me secure Alberta, more sovereignty within Canada. Let me remove Ottawa's influence where it can't understand the needs of this province. So we can keep Alberta within Canada, but also ensure that all Albertans can prosper. Her approach to separation is not the Liberal NDP approach of you don't matter to me and your problems aren't real, that kind of denial and that kind of elitism. It is the approach of I understand you, I hear you, there are problems, and I want to fix those problems so you can stay in Canada. It's just a real shame that the people with the real power at the end of the day are the people who are inclined to the view that Premier Smith does not support.
Yeah, but I want to circle back to you talking about the Forever Canada petition, which might give Danielle Smith a third option for the referendum. If she doesn't want to call a vote on separatism immediately, and if the appeal doesn't work, she could just put through the committee in the legislature could put through the Forever Canada petition, which hasn't been challenged, and that would act the same way as the separatism one. So it could generally give her the third option if the other two don't seem that appealing. So I didn't realize that before, but she has that backup plan if she really needs it, which is funny because CBC just released an article saying there is no plan B. This could be plan B.
I would rather it didn't have to get to that point, to be honest. No, just the kind of having to go in circles and knots just to get to the point where we can declare separation a non-issue, or not a non-issue per se, but the prospect of separation settled, so that we can finally declare that our approach has to be solving the issues that are creating separatists rather than separation being the focal point of everything. That should be our end goal, but I would rather it would just be one and done, and we would have either Mr. Lukaszuk's petition gets pushed through into a referendum, or the separatists get pushed through in a referendum, but not, we wanted to go with the separatist petition, but now we're going to go with Lukaszuk's because the courts are doing their shenanigans. We're just put in a really bad position as federalists who truly understand and can empathize with the separatists.
Yeah, it's sad. Quebec managed to get 2 referendums, and we can't manage to get 1.
That raises an interesting point, actually. Where was the Indigenous consultation requirement? Where was the court challenge to Quebec's separation referendum? I don't believe that there. I know that 1980 happened before the Constitution Act, 1982, but the 1995 referendum happened well after. There was no consultation requirement. There was no court challenge. There was nothing. The federal government's approach was let it happen.
And they
And
almost
the
lost.
federal government, yeah, and the federal government and the Liberal government, by the way, the federal government has taken a conciliatory approach with Quebec. And when I say this, I don't mean to demean Quebecers. I don't mean to delegitimize the problems that they have. And I certainly don't mean to imply that they're entitled or anything like that. But the federal government takes a very different approach to Quebec separatism than they do to Alberta separatism. Maybe that's just because they don't see Alberta separatism as a serious threat. But then again, they didn't really view Quebec separatism as a serious threat in 1980. Right? The 1980 referendum was defeated with around 60% of the vote. And Pierre Trudeau, 2 years later, he decided to push through a constitution that Quebec did not support without the knowledge of Quebec's premier, René Lévesque. They're doing the same thing with Alberta. And I'm just wondering how long until we get to the 1995 point where we have a referendum decided by a hair's margin and the federal government finally realizes they have to do something. Why should we have to get to that point? Because now there will always be separatists who feel legitimized by 1995 in Quebec, including the leader of the Parti Québécois, Mr. Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, who was promised to get another third referendum through should he win a government. All we're asking for is the same kind of conciliatory approach, the same I understand you and I want to solve your problems approach that the federal government has given to Quebec for their very real issues to be applied to our very real issues as well. And I don't understand why it's so hard for the federal government to understand that, or even for the liberal aligned people in Alberta to understand that.
Yeah, and speaking of problems plaguing our province, let's talk about ideology in schools. We've recently passed Bill 25, which requires schools to ask for permission to put up a third-party flag other than the Albertan or Canadian flag. It restricts teachers from taking sides when teaching about ideology, and it allows for employees to abstain from events that counter their beliefs. It also forces school boards, elected school boards, to be politically neutral. So since me and you are both still in school, me not so long for long,
Hmm.
do you have any
Lucky you.
personal experiences you have with ideology impacting your experience at school?
Well, as a proud student of the Alberta public education system, yeah, it's quite bad, to say the least. I have especially I remember in elementary school it wasn't really present, and I know that might seem obvious, of course, because in elementary school you can't understand politics, but that's when you're most impressionable. That's when you can be indoctrinated the best, when you're very young. But there was no political indoctrination when I was in elementary school. Then in junior high, also, pretty much. I mean, they took a very liberal approach to gender, sexuality, culture war issues that could be seen. And they also did, enable students who had different gender identities and were exploring that, which I don't necessarily agree with, because I think that should be a decision firmly with the parents and with the parents' consent. Luckily, the government introduced legislation relating to that while I was in junior high. But now in high school, maybe it's just because I did my education in Edmonton, even though that's a very NDP area. But here in Sherwood Park, in high school, I have seen so many instances of teachers expressing their ideology. I've heard teachers call Premier Smith a separatist. I know one teacher who said that Premier Smith should be, who joked about Premier Smith being hit by a car. And I think you get a very clear vibe from the teachers that they support the New Democratic Party. I know one teacher who gave us a American written book by a progressive activist. It wouldn't seem like to most of my classmates, they are not really concerned about politics. But if you look on the back cover, it says that the author was a writer for Mother Jones, which is an American left-wing publication. So she wrote a book which promoted the kind of racial identity politics which we as conservatives we truly detest because it promotes division between people based on something so arbitrary as race. And I talked to my classmates and they said, I hated that book. I didn't like it. It was a poorly written book. Why weren't we doing our book reviews and our book studies on classics? Right? And I'm not saying that there can't be explorations of political ideology in schools. The grade 12 social studies curriculum is all about exploring your ideology. But all I want, teachers can even express their views for all I care. And I'm not saying that the teachers have to all be conservatives. They have their reasons for being in the NDP, and that's perfectly fine for them. And they shouldn't be, banned from political participation or anything like that. And the legislation doesn't do that. But if they are to express a viewpoint in class, they should be required to allow students to challenge that. And that should really only be in social studies class. I don't understand why racial identity politics should come up in English class. I don't understand why Premier Smith, your disgust for Premier Smith should come up during a extracurricular activity, right? But you've certainly had your own experiences as well, I'm sure, right? Although you do live rural, so maybe not quite as much.
Well, it's so bad. I have
Goodness.
I will tell a very long story because I have multiple of them, and I think it's an important distinction. I'm going to talk about my grade 9 teacher, or maybe it's grade 10. It was one of the mid years of junior high school, and he came in. Our first teacher kind of disappeared. I think he was working at the office at the time. Anyways, this new teacher comes in, and one of the first things I remember him talking about is saying he's a proud communist. Okay, cool. But this is something that would happen a lot. And I remember there being a lot of talking about communism and his values and stuff like that. I remember when we got to Tommy Douglas, the unit on Tommy Douglas, he leaned very heavily into that kind of aspect. Like he said that Tommy Douglas is the most important Canadian in Canadian history, which is up to interpretation, but it's up to the student's interpretation. I would argue the people who, made insulin are pretty important, or
I would argue Sir John A. Macdonald is very important.
exactly.
Right.
So to be a teacher and then telling young impressionable children, the guy who made free healthcare, which you can argue is a good thing, is the most important Canadian, you're making a distinction of what values are, and that's not what a teacher should be doing. I haven't seen him since, if that's any evidence, but that kind of teacher is bad. But I do want to bring attention to my grade 11, 12 social teacher, and they are much different. And it's where I get concerned with this legislation that completely kind of gets rid of that, because I come up to this teacher very often to get their point of view. I like to hear from them. And that's one of the most enjoyable things about my education is that I'm come outside of class time, of course. I'm not doing this during the learning period, but before or after class, I come to this teacher and I ask, oh, I saw this. This is how I feel about it. How about you? And I would hope that, I'm not saying I'm normal, but I hope other kids would be able to still be able to do that, be able to have these discussions. Because as a conservative, I'm surrounded by very monolithic kind of point of views coming towards me. So it's nice to hear that. And how they handle the class is much different than how the communist teacher has it. You can kind of tell, you can always kind of tell how someone feels about something, but they make sure that it's neutral, that people are allowed to have their own opinions. They have never gone mad at me for being conservative. I've never gone mad at them for not being conservative. And it's that kind of respectful environment that I hope this legislation doesn't get rid of, because I think it's very valuable. On the topic of ideology in classrooms, and you brought up LGBTQ issues, one of the biggest things I wish people understood is that I understand, maybe for you, it doesn't make sense to learn about that. But for someone like me, I remember doing health class. We know what topic I'm talking about. The sex ed in health class for me was not very helpful. So I understand that we don't want certain, telling kids this is how something is. But we also need to recognize that LGBT kids like myself also deserve a standard of education. And so while everyone else understood things way more, some kids are not going to look at health class and not have the same understanding. And so that's why I think we need to make a distinction of what is crucial for a kid's education and whether or not their personal identity requires for that education to differ.
Well, on the topic of sexual education, I do agree with you somewhat. I think that, if we, for the sake of protecting children, end up with children who don't understand how to for to find the best term to conduct intercourse in a sanitary manner. If we don't teach students about safe sex, then you're going to get a lot more cases of students doing things that get them health problems and the like. So I do think that sex education is important, but it's kind of from the same perspective as I guess this is a bad analogy, but the drug decriminalization versus punitive drug policy. And what I mean by that is the approach that I think you're advocating for is more related to harm reduction. So rather than not teach students about things that aren't related to heterosexuality, right? You would teach them about homosexuality, about different gender, for the purpose of ensuring that they aren't confused when they grow up. They aren't confused. They don't do unsafe things, which I think is fair. So yeah, I do agree that it has to be balanced between the need to protect children's innocence and allow them to choose their own identity and discover who they are on their own, in consultation with their parents, in consultation with community groups and others, without the interference of the school, and also the need to ensure that they have the knowledge they need to not do things that are not appropriate for them. I think that's something that the government likely has considered, and I think that they should consider thoroughly. They should, consult all different groups. Now, unfortunately, it's a very polarizing issue. So I think it would be hard to find a consensus between the two sides of the debate, but I'm hopeful it can be done. As for, the point about your social studies teacher, I also, funnily enough, have a social studies teacher who is quite ideological and who I do like to speak about on political issues, and we're very different. I think maybe her favorite prime minister is Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and I do not hold a particularly favorable or charitable view of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. She supports multiculturalism very strongly, and I don't. And just those sorts of things. We have very strong divergence. I think it's the fundamental difference between the Conservative Party of yore and the Liberal Party of yore. The Trudeau Liberals versus the Diefenbaker Conservatives, I guess you could say. And we have good discussions. However, unlike your social studies teacher, her bias is quite obvious in her education. It's unfortunate. And, sometimes I will, raise my hand and say, wait, but you're wrong. The premier is not a separatist. But of course, that would be using up class time, so I don't really do it. And she doesn't like that, to be fair, for the same reason, using up class time. How I think it should be handled is, first, teachers present the facts. First, give it from a neutral perspective. For example, on the topic of Tommy Douglas, I personally do have a lot of admiration and respect for Tommy Douglas. I think he came from a very good worldview, even if I feel that the way that he put his views into policy, his view on socialism, for example, he was a socialist. I don't agree with that, but I think that he was a very good person. It's one thing to say, he's the founder of public healthcare in Canada. He is considered by many to be the greatest Canadian. He ran a very successful government in Saskatchewan, and talk about his legislative achievements, his political achievements, yes. But you can't ignore the fact that he was also a supporter of eugenics. He during the 1968 Canadian federal election debate, he promoted the view that homosexuality is a mental disorder, which isn't accepted nowadays, and we understand it to be not medically accurate. So that has to be included as well. You have to give a full perspective, because no politician is perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect politician. Even, we are very supportive of Premier Danielle Smith, but I'm sure we both have our disagreements with her. There's no such thing as a perfect politician, and teachers cannot let their biases get in the way. They should explain the facts first, and then let the students develop their own view, and then they can, they can start introducing their view into the discussion to get the discussion going. And you'll have students who interpret, for example, talking about Sir John A. Macdonald. He was the father of Canada. He is the father of the nation. We wouldn't be here without it. But also the actions done to Indigenous people under his government were obviously terrible. So you might have a kid who says, hey, I think that we should respect Sir John A. Macdonald because we wouldn't be here without him. And then you'd have another student who says, yes, but look at his legacy. And he made statements that would be interpreted as white supremacist. And you could have a discussion going and the teacher would provide his or her view. You don't get that nowadays. It's the teacher's view is it bleeds into the part where the teacher's just supposed to explain the founding principles. And that's how you get students who have a very warped view of Canadian history and politics. Most of them, I don't particularly see my classmates as politically inclined. They're not going to go into researching politics and diving deep in their adult lives, and they have no obligation to look through Canadian history, all right? But they're going to have a skewed view. For example, I doubt that most Canadians know that the Indian Act was introduced by a Liberal government. No, because that's not taught in schools, because the narrative is that Sir John A. Macdonald was the only person who was treating Indigenous people badly. So it's those kinds of things. They might seem small, but it really does shape the worldview of students, and it's really, really dangerous. So I am glad that this legislation is being pushed through. I hope that it won't restrict legitimate discussion of classroom perspectives with the teacher involved. I think this legislation might, and if it does, then I wouldn't support that aspect. But generally, as a whole, I think this is a very good step in the right direction, and I'm glad that this is happening in the province. And I mean, we're just finally an end to the bias and everything.
Yeah, and I'm glad you talked about kids going back and forth in class, because I'm going to once again bring about my teacher. That's what we do. I remember we sat in a circle, like we got the whole desk in a circle, whole class sat in a circle, and we talked about whether or not, the difference between Hiroshima and Nagasaki and 9/11, which one is, which one is considered redeemable and which one's not. And that's not what I'm trying to talk about. But, we do have those conversations in my class, and
Yeah, we do.
they are someone I consider a good social teacher. And we also have to recognize that this isn't a partisan issue. This is bipartisan.
Yeah.
There have been conservative teachers who have done it, have probably put their views too much. I remember there was one Central Alberta, I don't remember their name, but there have been cases. So this is a problem for both sides. Is it more heavily on the more left-leaning teachers? Yes, but
yeah, but I would just like to, sorry to interrupt you, but I would like to say, I wouldn't say that's a characteristic of people on the left. That I wouldn't say that necessarily shows that they want to indoctrinate students. It's just because there's more left-leaning teachers in the system overall. More left-leaning people want to be teachers than right-leaning people. But yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. And I also want to talk to you because the government gave an example of one of the reasons they wanted to bring in this legislation. And we have enough time to talk about it, so let's talk about it. It is this video of, so I believe it was in the Edmonton School Board, this Muslim child abstained from attending school because of pride events. And so what happened was when that child came back to school, the teacher berated the child about being treated fairly, because if the kid wanted to be treated fairly for being the color they are and the religion they are, they should respect, LGBTQ kids, which not our point of view.
At elementary
LGBTQ
school.
Was in elementary school?
That should stay out of elementary school in the first place.
Okay, because it's ridiculous in the first place to even expect a kid to show up. I am LGBTQ, and if you want to stay home while we have a small event, that is up to you. It should not be the place of a teacher to mandate you to come to school to participate. Yeah. And it was funny because she butchered Ramadan. She's like, she didn't say it right. So I'm like, this is a this.
Ramadan.
She said Ramadan. She did say Ramadan. And I was like, this is the most racist thing I've ever heard in my life, to say that for the kid to be treated fairly as a, different color or as a Muslim, that he has to treat, certain kids correctly. Which I think that if the kid was bullying LGBTQ kids, that's a different conversation. But the fact that this teacher was berating a child for their personal beliefs is ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, we're a multi-religious society, and religious freedom is an important part of our society and has to remain an important part. So, when we have all of these different diverse groups of people in our society, and they often come into conflict, we have to find a way to ensure that everyone can coexist. And that's obviously, the example you're giving is heinous. It's favoring one group over the other. I personally, I come from a very conservative denomination of Buddhism, and we don't support. That's not to say that I don't support LGBTQ people, but my religion does not support it, right? So I would not participate in any pride activities if I was compelled to. I'm very lucky that I haven't been compelled to participate in activities which I cannot in good conscience support. But if I were, I would walk out. I would not do it because that goes against my view and my faith. And it is not the job of the government to change people's faith. That is what I would call really some form of secular proselytization, right? Trying to force the secular anti-religious viewpoint onto children who are religious. Now, in the first place, that shouldn't have even been an issue because LGBTQ identity should stay out of elementary schools at the very least. I believe that it should stay within sex ed classes only. But at the very least, it should stay out of elementary schools. That is completely unacceptable. So, I mean, yeah, and it just it's just a very sad case to hear. And that child is probably, now that he is, what I find with students who are truant, who don't go to school, is that once you stop going to school for a while, it becomes normalized. Like for me, I had a pretty bad attendance record because COVID, everyone was at home and there wasn't really an incentive to do anything. So it normalizes in you that you can just coast through school. And so I feel like that kid is probably going to have a tough time going forward because truancy has now been normalized for him. It is creating bad education outcomes for people. All of this, that is, yeah, I'm really sad to hear that.
Yeah. But I think this is a good point that, you've mentioned that your religion doesn't support that, and my identity is that. And I think this is a point where, though we are opposites, we agree very much, because my community has these events, but I'm not going to throw a hissy fit because you didn't show up. That's not something I'm going to be upset about. It's made, and that's why I think that some people have kind of lost the point of these events. It's for us. It's not for you. I don't know why people are expecting non-LGBTQ people to show up. I mean, if they're an ally, that's fine, but you can't be having this idea that just because you are something, then you must expect everyone else to be, supportive of that. And it goes in the opposite direction too. As a Buddhist, I'm not a Buddhist, but so I don't show up to Buddhist events.
Yeah,
but
I'm not going to force you to read all 50 volumes of our text. Absolutely not.
But exactly. But at least we can have the respect that we have two different beliefs. We have two different communities, and we have our own events. And let's stick to our own events. We don't have to force each other to go to each other's events.
Yeah.
That's dumb. So should we move on to the immigration bill?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Bill 26, it requires companies to register with the Albertan government before they can register for the federal foreign workers program. And so what the UCP is hoping for this to do is to reduce fraud and give us better control over our temporary foreign workers. Do you believe, Seth, that this will be effective to helping our unemployment numbers?
Well, first of all, I think that there's, unemployment, I feel like it's just one aspect of the problems with the temporary foreign worker program. But I do believe that this is at the very least a step in the right direction. I think this is a good policy. I think it's a creative way to work around the control that the federal government has over the immigration the immigration policy. Now, ideally, we would have control over our immigration intake provincially, because we might have a worker shortage one day, and in Nova Scotia they wouldn't. Why should both of our provinces have the same immigration intake? And it goes vice versa. We might have too many people, as we do now, and Nova Scotia might not have enough people. So why should it not be a provincial issue? The whole point of our federal system is that the East is different from the West, and at any given time, a different part of the country, a different province, is going to have a different situation than another. And on those matters, the federal government should not step in. But what we've seen from the temporary foreign worker program is more than just unemployment. Unemployment is the consequence, I think, that we feel the most. And as someone who's been looking for a job for a very long time, of course, it's hard when you have to compete with not just people in your community, but also temporary foreign workers. It has also led to the exploitation of temporary foreign workers, because you bring people from countries that have very low opportunity, very low standards of living, and you bring them to Canada, a country that is a developed country, and they will be willing to do anything as long as they can make money here, because what happens back home is far, far worse than what even our worst conditions could be. And so, they're subject to terrible hours, terrible working conditions, and they accept it anyway. So it is more economically efficient to hire a temporary foreign worker than it is to hire a Canadian citizen or even a Canadian permanent resident. And that's not just an economic problem now, it's a moral problem. When we allow people from foreign countries, we tell them, oh, you're going to have opportunity. You're going to have opportunity in this country. You're going to make money, and will treat you well, and really they're just exploited. It is no, I'm hoping that we get federal temporary foreign worker reform. I think Carney has been pretty perceptive to the anti-immigration sentiment that has been brewing in Canada. I hope that he makes the reforms that the federal Conservatives have recommended. But until then, we've got to step up and we've got to say that this is wrong. The exploitation, the economic consequences, the consequences for youth especially, because the jobs that temporary foreign workers are asked to fill are the jobs that youth would normally take. The Tim Hortons cashiers, right? That's the job that you'd work in high school to make some money and save up for whatever you want. That's the job you'd work to get you through university. And this has just really disrupted our system.
Yeah, and I do think this legislation is important. I'm glad that we are seeing Carney going in the right track. Asylum seekers are down 30-ish%. We're down in immigration as a whole. We're down in foreign students is down. So
we actually had negative population growth. Yeah, so
he's bringing our immigration numbers down. But I think the most important thing about this legislation is that it gives us guardrails for the future. Because after Trudeau, we learned that it only takes one bad prime minister to ruin a whole generation for jobs and for the economy as a whole. So it only takes one prime minister. So I'm glad that we are bringing in legislation to have those to give us more control to protect us from any future Trudeau's. Could you imagine if Trudeau had a kid and then that one's going?
The Trudeau dynasty keeps going. Only this time it's 10 million instead of 1 million.
Exactly. And you bring up Tim Hortons, and it's so frustrating that, I feel like temporary foreign workers should be for, high-end, high-demand jobs,
Yeah.
But these people who are roughly educated from other countries come to Canada, which has better paying wages, so we entice them over here for engineering jobs if we're lacking in them. Why does Tim Hortons have a temporary foreign workers program? That doesn't make any sense. And especially when Albertan youth unemployment is at 14%? It's not okay. As I was lucky enough to Nepo baby my way into my first job, but you mentioned you've been looking for a job, and it's very hard to do. And that's another thing with this, making companies register with the provincial government. Perhaps we could start cutting back on these lower level jobs that perhaps could go to, the 14% of Albertan youth who don't. So that's what we need to look at. That's what I'm hoping for. You did bring up the exploitation, and that's something they bring up during the press conferences about this bill. Is that there's a lot of fraud and there's a lot of exploitation of workers happening, and so it might not get caught by the federal government. I mean, they have to look at the whole country of people registering for these programs. So hopefully, this allows us to be another filter on that and catch these companies before they do any harm to these foreigners.
I think that it's good that the government is speaking to not just the economic side, but the compassionate side as well. Because unfortunately, I'm sure that there are people watching who are young enough to remember a time when the New Democratic Party throughout the country actually cared about workers and would have said no to this kind of exploitation, but now they seem to be on a moral crusade. And that has implored them to deem any policy which seeks to reduce immigration as anti-immigrant. Now, we make the distinction between anti-immigrant policies and anti-immigration policies. There are many groups that are starting up now in Canada, and groups that already exist in Canada, like Second Sons, which are anti-immigrant, and they have a personal problem with immigrants themselves. We have a problem with immigration and the immigration system. And you can say that because we truly care for the welfare of the immigrants themselves. We believe that they're more than just numbers on a spreadsheet that are the cogs, the replacement cogs in our economy. We believe that they're human beings and they deserve dignity. And right now, under the current system, they are not getting the dignity which they deserve. So I'm not sure if the NDP media machine has started up to label this government as anti-immigrant. I know they were doing it previously when Premier Smith suggested that we should lower our immigration intake. I don't know if they've started it up now, but it's very clear that we don't hate immigrants, no matter what kind of hyperbole is pushed. I think, most of us would subscribe to the belief that Alberta was built by immigrants. And so for us to be anti-immigrant is benign. And you know what you'll find as well, actually, is that immigrant communities across the province and across the country are some of the most vocal anti-immigration voters. And it's not just with the temporary foreign worker problem. It's also with just how citizenship gets devalued. The value of citizenship gets devalued with uncontrolled levels of immigration, which we have been trying to rein in. So I truly could not tell you why certain people would label this policy as anti-immigrant, but I know that it will be labeled as anti-immigrant by the NDP and by the people on the left. Avi Lewis has yet to chime in on the matter and call Premier Smith evil and the things he does, but really, this should be studied, this phenomenon of the left defending exploitative immigration systems. Maybe we're just the pro-worker party now, who knows?
Yeah, you do. I like how you bring up how it's not helping them, right? Because you gotta think most people who are seeking jobs in our countries are coming from countries that have low wages, oversaturated markets where they can't find jobs. So if we're creating an environment that has too many people and it's oversaturated, that gives the company leverage to give lower wages. The more you can replace someone, the lower you can pay someone.
Mm-hmm.
So with how our immigration system has been, we're creating an environment that isn't going to is the kind of the thing they were coming from. They're coming here for a reason. Let's not make it so our people are going to different countries for temporary foreign workers.
Exactly. I call it a lose. Sorry to interrupt you there, but I call it a lose-lose. We call it compassionate to bring people from countries with low opportunity and fly them here so they can work Canadian jobs, they can make lots of money, and they can go back home and they can improve the welfare of their family, their community, and they can get ahead in life. But when they come here, there's no jobs, there's no housing. You can find footage of immigrants sleeping on the streets of Toronto or lining up all the way from the Tim Hortons to the subway down the street. I might be exaggerating a bit there, but lining up in droves to find jobs because we're not living through a time of abundance. We're not living through a time of high prosperity. We're living through a very difficult economic situation. And we cannot fulfill that promise of giving people opportunity or giving people jobs, giving people pathways to new heights. With this, when we're in this economic belt, we can't even provide for our own people. There are so many homeless people. There are so many poor. Like you said, 15% of youth are unemployed. And we think that there's opportunity. There's enough opportunity, not just for the people here, but also for people from other countries. It's an awful view. And that's also with the universities as well. We have no class space in our universities. Our professors are working the brink, yet we're bringing so many temporary students. I'm very glad that the Liberal Party is cutting, or not temporary students, but foreign students. Sorry. I'm very glad that the Liberal Party is cracking down on that, and especially since, again, exploitation. There are universities, they charge more for foreign students than they do for domestic students. And of course, the foreign students, they're not going to get a Canadian quality education in their home country. So they'll be willing to pay over the extortionist tuition fee. And they'll be willing, and they also need to find jobs so they can pay off the tuition. It's hurting the immigrants themselves. This pro-immigrant compassionate policy is not pro-immigrant at all. And one thing I think we have to do as conservatives, and I'm glad that the UCP is doing this, is reclaim the narrative and show that we are truly the compassionate option for immigrants and for people, for newcomers to Canada, because we are not going to uphold these exploitative, broken immigration systems with the justification, the false pretense of compassion.
Yeah. Alberta has had good job growth lately. And if we're struggling, I can imagine how the rest of the provinces are doing.
Ontario is
Another
terrible. British
last
Columbia.
thing that I was really excited for about this is that since they have to register with the provincial government, it gives the provincial government an idea of what kind of trades or areas we are lacking. So if there's a lot of companies that are applying for foreign, like a lot of welding companies that are applying for foreign workers, our government can recognize, hey, we are lacking in this area. Perhaps we could have a program to incentivize our people to start going into this field. And so it gives our government a better view of our situation, because it was mentioned during the press conference that the federal government does not share the data with us. They don't share anything with us. So this legislation will give us a look into what's going on with our economy.
That's good. I think that's just yet another example of the UCP government. I think that we are the government out of every province, and including the federal government as well. We are the government that is innovating the most. No, not we, I guess. I'm not a cabinet minister. We are the UCP. So
this legislation is already in Saskatchewan and BC.
We are working to innovate more than any other province. And so, we've done things, we've been moving ahead with policies to protect children as well, which we're the first in Canada to start advancing these policies, which aligns with popular opinion as well. We're working on carbon capture, which is, I believe, part of the key to the future for a more sustainable future. This is a government that innovates, and that's just one small example of how the UCP is looking towards the future, I think.
Yeah, and I think overall we're doing great.
With that said, we're out of time. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to see more, give this episode a like and subscribe to the Strathcona-Sherwood Park Constituency Association YouTube channel. Did you agree with us? Did you disagree with us? Got feedback? Comment your thoughts down below. And as always, thank you for watching. Good.